Hi, Johanna. Hope you're well. So
Hello.
let's go straight to the big picture. I guess let's start with the big picture. So many things are feeling rather uncertain these days. We have inflationary pressures that we talked about earlier, an energy crisis, concerns about tapering and potentially rising interest rates, geopolitical risks, China contagion, Evergrande, the list goes on. So what would be your advice to clients now?
Well, of course, every environment is always different. There's always new elements, but there are some underlying patterns. And what we're seeing right now is very typical of what you get when the economic cycle is maturing. We've had a very strong reopening since vaccines were announced this time last year. And now we're seeing a sort of moderation in that economic recovery. And typical of this phase of the cycle is concerns about valuation, concerns about peaking growth momentum, and of receding central bank liquidity. Now, all our work suggests, though, that there is still more money to be made from equities. So ultimately, yields are still low, corporate earnings are still firm. So I think it's too early to withdraw into our bear caves, if you will. Certainly, our advice would be to remain invested.
Moving slightly on to fixed income. So with yields so low, do you think that bonds still have a role to play in portfolios? What about gold or cryptocurrencies?
So there is still some room to go in terms of the repricing of inflation risk and rate risk in bonds. So, we would still be underweight that asset class, but I wouldn't write them off entirely because ultimately there is still a risk of peaking growth momentum in 2022. And central banks are still very actively managing the long end of the curve. So I think there is still a role for government bonds in the portfolio. However, we do need to think about potentially a more inflationary environment for years to come, partly as a result of the pandemic. And in that context, I think there are other allocations we need to consider as a source of diversification in the portfolio. So gold could be one of those. Gold historically has been a good hedge against low real yields, rising inflation. So I think that is a good allocation. We also like the dollar because it's actually a good hedge against the potential for liquidity to recede. With regard to cryptocurrencies, my view is more mixed. I think the cryptocurrencies are a way of maybe benefiting from this new money technology. I see that more as a return generator than a hedge in the portfolio. I think sometimes crypto is positioned as an alternative to gold, as a store of value. And I think that actually that is not the right way to think about it. It is not a defensive asset class. It's a way of generating return, as I said, from the adoption of the new technology.
Very interesting. Moving slightly on to a topic more closer to, I guess, the theme of this conference and also close to my own heart. Schroders are known as a leader in sustainability, and way long before ESG even became a popular concept. So as early as 19 years ago, Schroders had already started to engage Royal Dutch Shell on its climate ambitions. And now Shell has set a target to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050, which is quite impressive. So can you please share your views on the role that investors can have in driving business agenda and environmental commitments?
As active investors, we believe passionately in engaging with companies to ensure that ultimately they're creating more sustainable business. So by engaging with them on matters we think are going to matter over the long term, we believe that then ultimately we're essentially ensuring a thriving investment universe from which we can pick our stocks. So it's in our interest to engage with companies, as I said, to ensure that we then have a very broad range of investments to pick up from. And Shell is a good example of that, engaging with them over the years to a point where now today they're a company that even as an oil company, you can consider investing in the context of a sustainable transition. So for us, it is about creating that great investment universe. Now, crucially though, in terms of engaging with companies, obviously, we can be active at AGMs, which we often are. But I think it's also about the work we do behind the scenes with companies over a period of years, really working with them, using our tools often to understand their businesses. So I'll give you an example of that. We have a proprietary tool called Carbon VaR, which allows us to assess the impact of rising carbon prices on a company's earnings. That's the kind of tool that we can use to engage with companies on climate to help them understand the risk that they are running in their business. And obviously the resources we have are significant in this area. So again, a simple example of how we engage over the long term with our companies.
And why Schroders place such large emphasis on sustainability and what can that mean for investors?
Well, if you think about it, I mean, after 1929, the Great Depression, you saw this standardization of accounting standards, starting from the United States, which pretty much everyone has been using as investors ever since. And that allowed us to really understand the inner workings of a company better, but ultimately ignore the broader impact to society of that company's activities, the positive and negative externalities that they generated. What we've developed in recent years is the ability to assess that broader impact to society of each company that we invest in. And it gives us a much deeper understanding of the environment within which they're operating, the risks that they're taking, and ultimately the sustainability of their business over the long term. So for us, it's an important dimension of active investment, is understanding those broader impacts. We see it as a source of analytical advantage that actually positions us to outperform our peers over the long term with our investment performance. So that's how we think about it. We really see it as an opportunity to generate stronger returns for our clients. In terms of the lessons from the pandemic, it's quite interesting because, I also listened to the presentation earlier and I thought that was very relevant. There are a number of lessons. I mean, first of all, like the financial crisis of 2008, what the pandemic showed us is sometimes extreme events do happen and you have to have the imagination to understand that. I think having been through the financial crisis this time as investors, we were much quicker to understand the implications of the pandemic, and how extreme it could get. So that was a lesson we learned in 2008, but we've been reminded of with the pandemic. I think there are two other key lessons that we've learned from the pandemic. One is obviously it allowed us to work in new ways, really using technology to interact. And while obviously in-person interaction is also important, as investors, it also allows us to spend time sometimes at home in the relative silence of our homes, and also allows us to share information more broadly across the company using virtual techniques. So I think actually the pandemic allowed us to work in a way that was more flexible, but ultimately also more conducive to making better investment decisions. Coming back to the point made earlier about maybe doing a little less and having a bit more silence in our lives so that we could really think things through. And I think finally, what the pandemic showed also was the importance of looking after your employees. And this is something that we engage with our companies as well. People talk a lot about climate, but also ensuring that with investing in companies that treat their workers well, we actually believe that again results in better long-term performance. And I think the pandemic reminded us that we need to understand the challenges that our employees might be facing outside of the office. It led us to a much more holistic understanding of our employees. And again, it's something that, again, we bring to bear when we look at the companies that we invest in.
Your insights into relationship and how it may differ from other institutional relationships that you have?
I think the big difference is how we partner about the overall structure of the portfolio. So, when we were first talking, we managed this mandate for many years at Schroders, and really our objective has always been working in partnership with St. James's Place to really think about how we can evolve that portfolio over time to create what I call a living and breathing portfolio that adapts to the new challenges. Historically, for example, we had quite a UK home bias for many years. We've moved to a more global approach in recent years, which has been very beneficial to the returns. And that's something that we worked on in partnership with St. James's Place. As I said, it's really a portfolio focused on the long term, looking to evolve over many years to cope with a changing environment. And I think the interesting thing about the pandemic is it's created so much disruption that actually having that inbuilt flexibility and that ability to work together on the broader shape of the portfolio, I think stands us in good stead. Again, as mentioned earlier, you can't necessarily predict the future, but what you want to have is a structure that can adapt to new environments quickly. And that's something I think that we built with this partnership that we have with St. James's Place.
So much for sharing your thoughts, Johanna. Insightful. I'm now going to bring Rob Gardner back for our Q&A segment. To the audience, if you have any questions that you would like to ask any of our experts who have appeared this evening, so that's Rob, Johanna, or Daniel, all you need to do is to put them into the chat function.